Okay, in this video I'm going to take a look at the possible deleting of swirl flap functions from an EDC16 file. This is a file taken from an Audi V6. These engines, a lot of these V engines and some of the four-cylinder engines have got these swirl flaps fitted. If you're looking at this, you probably know that the swirl flaps do on occasion break or jam. If you're really unlucky, they break and get sucked into the engine and cause severe engine damage. So it's really not a good idea just to make changes to ECU files. You really do need to deal with the mechanics as well. Maybe change the manifolds or just strip out the old mechanical parts and then reassemble with the flaps missing, but what you choose to do for that part is entirely up to you. Now, the way these flaps or the maps for these flaps is arranged in files is not always the same, but there are two basic types. So the one I'm going to talk through at the moment is the simplest of the two basic types, and it tends to look like this. In other words, what you tend to get is a base map, which is this one, which is quite big and has fairly obvious shape to it. At either side of it, you usually find a correction map, which looks like a miniature version of the base map. And on the other side, a similar correction map, which often looks like this map here. It often looks like the first map. On this one, you can see it's just got one little set of results or values, and then it just goes flat. But quite often, it will look like that map. So don't be surprised if you find you've got a shape like that, then the base map, and then that is repeated over here. Equally, don't be surprised if you've got a shape like this here and over here. The shapes do vary quite a bit. Now, this one here and this one here are correction maps. There is usually a correction map for atmospheric pressure and a correction map for temperature. So very often they will be correction map here for pressure and one here for temperature. Sometimes there are other correction maps to go with it, and there definitely will be other correction maps with some of the other more complicated files, but as I say, this is one of the simplest. So we've got correction map, base map, correction map. You can find this same configuration of maps in ordinary four-cylinder engines that haven't got swirl flaps fitted. But what you normally find then is that this correction map here will just be a flat line, so all the values will be 0, and this correction map here will be a flat line, all the values will be 0, and this one is usually a flat line as well, but all the values have been set, and the values have been set at what is a value of 50%. That will appear on a map as something like 05000. Now, the easiest way to look at this, obviously, is to look at it in 2D, because in 2D you can see the picture of what you're looking at, but when it comes down to the actual nitty-gritty of the numbers, you really need to see the text. So if we change to the text, here we've got, if I drag it down a little bit more, give us a bit more room, I can just about get those three maps on there. So there's the first correction map, there's the main or the base map, and there's the second correction map. If we look just before this first correction map, you can see here a very small map. It's got 5 values in it. And if you look, you've got what is probably 700, 750, 800, 850, 870. So they are probably millibar values for pressure. So in other words, this is a correction map for pressure, and this is followed by one which again is 5 values. The values, look, 263.1, 2731. These are probably temperatures. In other words, 2731 is probably 273.1 Kelvin or 0 degrees 0. So in other words, these are probably the correctors or the corrections for temperature for this overall map. These are then repeated. So in other words, this pressure map here as a little two-dimensional map is repeated here as a three-dimensional map, and this little temperature map here is repeated again here as a three-dimensional map. Now, this doesn't really matter to you as a person who wants to change a map, because all you would really want to do is to change all of these values to 0 anyway. So you would probably want to just change all of those by going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 zeros, pressing enter, saying yes, I'd like to apply those changes. Okay, and now we've got everything is 0, so we're not going to be correcting this map. So that's now no corrections. And of course we would want to do the same thing for this one. So we would want to go and say, right, well, we'll want that one all set at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, enter, and now that one has got no corrections on it at all. So we've got rid of all the corrections. And of course it would make sense to have no corrections on these maps as well, so it wouldn't be a bad idea to make sure that those are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, enter, so they're now all 0, and these are all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are now all 0. So now we've got all the correction map there switched off, that correction map there switched off, that correction map there switched off, and that correction map there switched off. Now what you don't want to do is to touch these values here, which you can see between the two maps. You've got a map here, and you've got a series of values here. Now you don't want to make any changes to those, because these appear to be settings used by the ECU when it is not using these maps. So in other words, you find these sets of values in virtually every EDC16 map, and they seem to be base values to use if there is no swirl flap system being used. So you never want to change those, you just want to leave those as they are. Right, now that leaves us with this. Now this base map, if you look, as I said earlier, at an ordinary file for a vehicle that's got a similar engine but hasn't got the swirl flaps fitted, you will find that this map is all 0, which is what we've just done. This map is all 0, which is what we've just done. These values will be the same, which is why you don't want to change them. And these are set at 50%. So in other words, they are set at 0, 5, 0, 0, 0, like that, all over. So if I just click that, so now they're all set at 0, 5, 0, 0, 0, which is 50%. So you don't want to set them at 0, which seems the obvious thing to do, because when VAG do this to their cars, they set this at 50 when there is no value. So in other words, when it's not being used, it's set at 50%. Now this file also, being a simple file, has another little trick up its sleeve, which is that after this map you get this sequence, and it seems to occur in lots of these files. You've got a set of zeros. Of course, we're looking in 16-bit mode, so you will get 5 numbers for each value here. So we've got a set of zeros, and then we get 4, 4, 800. Now you can ignore the rest of this, but this is fairly common, this set of zeros, then the 4, then the 4, and then this 800. These two seem to be some sort of time, and the 800 I think is something related to idle speed, so you may not get 800 there, you might get something like 850 or 900 or something, but it's usually something similar to the idle speed you'd expect for that vehicle. This is a swirl flap switch, but not in the sense of simply turning them on and off, although it does seem to turn them on and off. When it's got all these zeros here, that appears to mean that these maps will function. So in other words, variable swirl flap control is in operation. If you change this to 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, enter, what you've now got is a 1 there, so you've changed the switch for this, and that 1 appears to tell the ECU that you are now not using these maps for variable function of swirl flaps. You simply have fitted to the car 2 position flaps. Now of course there's no such thing as 2 position flaps, but that seems to be what VW Audi call no flaps. So when there's no flaps fitted, they look at it as a 2 position system. I'm assuming that's either on or off, and what they mean by that is that the throttle flap is still working, so the air intake is either open or it's not. So I'm assuming that that's what they mean. Now I'm assuming then that the system defaults to these values here, which is why these values are found on engine ECUs that don't have the flaps enabled, and this is often set to 1 on those as well. So again, it helps show that that's the value for not enabling the swirl flaps. So we have a sort of double approach here. If we set this value to 1, in theory the car will simply ignore, or the ECU will simply ignore these maps. But for safety's sake, what I suggest you do is you set this to 1 and then this map to 0, this one to 05000 all over, this one to 0, and then these 2 little 2-dimensional calibration maps or adjustment maps or correction maps, whatever you want to call them, but set those to 0 as well. And once that's done for this particular type of file, you should have now swirl flaps that do not work, so they do not move. And if the only fault was that they were jamming before and throwing up error codes, then if you're lucky they now will not do that, because they will now sit in one position. But the problem is if they already have reported to the ECU that they are jammed in a particular position, or that they've gone open circuit, you will still get error codes, and so you will then need to delete the error codes that you've got to clear that away. That is why I suggest that if you're going to do something like this, you strip out the manifold, strip out all the bits that you don't want, put everything back together without the flaps, then change the maps like this, and then finally delete any codes that are causing any problems, and then after that no more flaps to worry about. How that will affect the running of the car depends very much on how complicated the system is. Some of the more early vehicles don't seem to care whether you take this out or not, and on some other cars you can feel a sort of a hesitation, and generally the car doesn't feel quite so good when either pulling away or accelerating through the gears as it did when the swirl flaps were working. So what you choose to do with this obviously is entirely up to you, but please don't just switch it off as a way of getting rid of the car to some unsuspecting person who then may well get the flaps sucked into the engine and a blown up engine, because that's not why I put these explanations together. Right, I'll stop there.